Welcome to Cracking Addiction. I'm Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and we have with us today Cindy Payne. Now, Cindy is a licensed professional counselor, and for those of you listening not from the United States, that means a therapist. She's the owner and operator of a very successful podcast, Reclaiming Me, and she's a therapist in private practice in Texas.
Yes.
Cindy, you're very busy, and thank you very much for giving me your time today. Welcome to the
Of
show.
course.
Now, we're going to be talking about trauma and, how that affects mental health. Tell me initially your first impressions of the kind of people that you see in your private practice.
Sure. So I have been in private practice now for about 6 years. And when I first started, I would see people from all different walks of life. But what I finally started to really kind of get my groove with was women who are high performing, pleasers, high functioning, recovering perfectionists who, underneath that performance, really struggle with trauma, and not just any kind of
Yeah.
trauma, but relational trauma. So trauma that perhaps formed in those really crucial formative years with their caregivers or their parents. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's deep. How do
Yeah,
we
it is.
unpack this? All right.
Sure.
Now, I'm from my background, I work in addiction.
Hmm.
And for me, trauma is a big cause of addiction. And so that's why I'm very interested in this subject. So I was hoping we could explore some common themes. And the last phrase that you gave alluded to the fact that what we call adverse childhood experiences actually, well, as they say, as it's called on the tin, it starts in childhood. So from your point of view, how do childhood experiences influence future behavior and future reactions to stress and possibly even addiction?
Sure. That's a great question. So, if you go back to the very basics of attachment and what happens when an infant attaches with their caregiver, they have an underdeveloped nervous system. And so they rely on that caregiver for attunement. So, things like being able to kind of settle your own emotions in order to tend to somebody else. Well, what I see a lot in my practice is women and men too, who maybe grew up with like a preoccupied caregiver that struggled with their own depression and anxiety, maybe their own addiction or adverse childhood experiences. So it really prevents them from being able to attune and regulate their own nervous system. So they have to figure out ways to get their needs met in other areas of life.
Let's talk about emotional regulation because when a child doesn't get consistent parenting, you mentioned the word attachment. What's your experience of dealing with people who don't have consistent loving parenting?
Mm, yeah. So there's cracks in the foundation, so to speak, right? So we
Mm,
have kind of four main types of attachment. We have secure
mm,
attachment, we have
mm,
anxious attachment, we have avoidant attachment, and what's called a disorganized attachment. And
mm,
I would say the majority of the population probably does not fall into 100% secure attachment, but
mm.
repair is often there and modeled, right? So even if there is a rupture, there is an opportunity to kind of say, okay, like let's get back on track. Let's move towards a more secure relationship. But when it's
Mm.
something like anxious, avoidant, disorganized, what we learn to do is we learn to use other coping mechanisms to get our needs met. And one of those could be fawning. For example. So I will go along and do whatever you need me to do. I will be whoever you need me to be in order for us to maintain this connection. And oftentimes that
Mm.
does show up in addiction in later years.
Yes,
Yeah.
fawning.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
that's a very interesting concept.
Mhm.
So, do you think fawning is more prevalent with anxious, avoidant, or disorganized attachment disorder?
Ooh, that is a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. I would say that I see it more often in attachment styles like anxious and maybe
Yeah,
disorganized. So I want you to be near me, but
yeah,
also
yeah.
I need you to go away.
Yes,
Yeah.
because this is an important. I mean, maybe we should explain what those words mean. I mean,
Mhm.
how would you define or give examples of the four main types of attachment disorder.
Oh, like anxious, avoidant, disorganized.
So what does anxious look like? What do anxious people, how do they behave? How do avoidant people behave? How do secure people behave in contradistinction to that? And how do disorganized people behave?
Sure. I have to go back to and give credit to their original study, which was done in the late 1970s by Mary Ainsworth. And what they did was they had infants in a room and they had their caregivers with them. The caregivers would leave. And then what they were studying was the reaction of the babies when the mothers re entered the room. And so if you have an anxious attachment style, it takes a while to kind of calm the infant's nervous system down, right? Like, I'm not really sure if it's safe to really be here in connection with you because you might leave again, right? So, like, I'm going to go back to my playing, but I'm still going to keep an eye out for you to see where you are in the room. Avoidant maybe looks more like, okay, I'm upset that mom left. And when mom comes back, I'm not going to go to her immediately and be soothed. I'm going to self soothe. I'm going to stay over here in my corner with my
Mm,
toys, right? Disorganized would look very different in that there might be some pushback to the caregiver. Like, I want you to soothe me, but I'm also very frustrated that you left,
yeah.
right? And so I'm going to be angry at the same time. So you'll see these kind of intermittent
Mm,
phases of like soothing, and then there's a disruption,
mm,
soothing, disruption. So it really is measured more
yeah.
about the repair than the rupture itself.
Absolutely. And, when that translates to adults, I see adults, especially in relationships, if you've got someone who's anxious in a relationship with someone who's avoidant, you end up with this dance where one person follows the other person around. And that, for me, is where you start losing your emotional boundaries. And that's when you start losing your ability to say no and your personal identity, which I think is the same as fawning, as you've described.
Yes.
So if we don't get, when we're growing up, if we don't get consistent positive love from our
Mhm.
primary caregivers, that then permeates how we behave for the rest of our lives, basically. But
Yes.
so too does the occurrence of actual trauma in childhood. I mean, let's
Hmm.
move on to this idea that when children learn that the world is not safe, that creates huge implications, both for mental and physical health as we become older. I mean, it really does disturb. But you said earlier, cracks in the foundation. I mean, trauma really does erode the foundation of our personality and our resilience, doesn't it?
Yes.
What would you say to that?
Yes, I think so. I think with the particular type of trauma that I work with the most in relational trauma, what I see often is this lack of trust, lack of sense of safety with anyone, right? And so
Mm,
because the trauma occurred in the relationship, what we have to do is we have to teach how we can heal through relationships. And that is
mm,
not an overnight process, right? It takes a
mm,
lot of stops and starts,
mm.
a lot of steps forward and then some steps backwards too to learn how to repair.
Yeah, yeah. So in my experience of managing people with addiction, and trauma is a big driver of addiction. There's very good evidence that even the exposure to parental disharmony or parental arguments can actually significantly increase your risk of developing mental health problems generally, but also specifically addiction problems. There was a big study done in Australia a couple of years ago where it was a cohort study following following people who were exposed to what was defined as childhood maltreatment, and that was a very broad definition. But the implications of childhood maltreatment, almost as it were little t trauma rather than just big T trauma, was pervasive and severe. So, in your practice, do you see people with struggles with substance use who have been through either big T or little T trauma?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I don't think I've ever worked with an individual that hasn't had some sort of consistent history with both little t or big T, because what we're talking about is we're talking about the inability to self-soothe and
Yes,
self-regulate. So yes, absolutely. I see it all the
yes,
time.
yes. Actually, that brings me on to another issue around addiction.
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate and blessed to work in an environment where I am surrounded by very wise people. And one of the pieces of wisdom that a lady colleague of mine shared with me that literally the other week, and I thought, I'm going to use that, and here I am using it. She
Yeah.
said to me that you'll never get better from addiction. You'll never
Mm.
recover unless you can learn how to emotionally regulate. And I mean, I'd known that kind of before, but it's to actually have it articulated that way, that you cannot recover unless you know how to emotionally regulate,
Yeah.
really brought it home. And I think this is what you're saying, that you're seeing people who cannot self-soothe other than through substances.
Mhm.
So how do you help those people in your practice?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think if I'm being totally transparent, I think we have to start by excavating what is lying underneath maybe years of reactive behavior, right? And so naming it, getting language around it, kind of doing this demolition phase, which is not pretty at first, right? Because many individuals that I work with, they have never really felt allowed to to feel angry, to feel the grief that maybe came from having a shortened childhood. And so bringing that to light, but not just leaving them with these big emotions, but giving them some basic resourcing. So that could look like learning how to locate where strong emotions are coming up in the body, which is not easy for folks who have lived in long periods of disassociation. So we work around somatic practices, learning to work with instead of against, that your body is very wise. It's always trying to communicate something with you if you will tune in and listen. I would never start doing trauma work with an individual that was not able to have some just very basic resourcing skills. So even just walking, that's bilateral stimulation. If you're feeling dysregulated, that left, right patterning can really help us settle the nervous system so that we can create a bigger container for ourselves to sort through some of these difficult things.
Cindy, that's all well and good, learning how to be somatically aware, but sometimes when you're at the cliff edge, nothing but a substance will will work for your emotional dysregulation. So at that point, what are there interventions that you recommend that people can use there and then immediately that will actually bring them back from the cliff edge?
Yeah. When you were asking that question, I was thinking about that phrase of like how addiction is the disease of isolation and how recovery really, I think, long term recovery I think requires us to be in community, and whether that is at like an AA group or just having a point person that you can turn to in any given moment and be able to give language to the shame that you're feeling. Because I think that the cliff, standing at the edge of the cliff, I think what happens sometimes is our body quite literally is feeling like it has no other option. We are in pure survival mode because shame blinds us, I think, to being able to feel resourced. So if we can have some practice of being in community, of having just one person to name our shame with, sometimes that can help bring it down, the intensity down just a bit, so that we can get to a place where we can practice some of those larger skills.
And if you're on your own, what can you do? How can you rapidly decrease the emotional intensity of your experiences so that you can actually then think
Yeah,
straight?
yeah. I would think the first thing for me is a state change in the body, right? So temperature changes.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a client that I was working with one time, and we would quite literally in sessions sometimes have a bowl of ice water where we could, if we were talking or working through something that was re-traumatizing and they were feeling flooded, we would do a state change right then and there with ice water. And
So
that
tell me
could be
about that.
putting
What
your
what
face. Yeah,
what do
that
you
could
do
be
there?
putting your face in it, putting your face in that ice water, putting your hands in there. A lot of I'd say, like, a lot of, like, soft touch. So being able to connect with hand on the chest or hand on your head, wherever you're feeling the intensity, and being able to name it, to tame it, right? To bring that prefrontal cortex part back online, because in the middle of that, their amygdala has completely hijacked their
Yeah.
line of thinking, so they're not thinking clearly.
Yeah. Yeah. That's absolutely true. Amygdala hijack. I've never made a good decision when my amygdala was in control of my brain.
Me either.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really important point is that people in recovery are confronted with multiple choice points on a daily basis. And their recovery is dependent on making the right decision at every single one of those choice points for every
Yes.
single day for the rest of their lives. And
Mhm,
so you
mhm.
need your prefrontal cortex to be online and in control at all times. And for me, emotional dysregulation is a big risk factor for relapse.
Yes, yes. Another thing too that just, came to mind is I don't know if you use this term with your clients a lot, but we talk a lot about playing the tape forward. So when you are in early recovery stages, being able to map out your day with potential pitfalls and kind of front load with some coping skills so that when they do get to that time of day or that environment that they know can bring up a lot of triggering emotions, that they will have an out. And it doesn't work all the time, but it's a great way to kind of get behind it, so to speak. So that was something that I just was thinking of as you
Mm,
were talking about that. Yeah.
mm. Now you deal with relational trauma, and
Mhm.
for me, relational trauma, we need to think about the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD because I think that's where we're going when we think about relational trauma. How would you conceptualize that
Yes.
difference?
Yeah. So when I'm explaining relational trauma versus just regular PTSD, think of PTSD as an isolated event. It could be a car accident or a natural disaster, or maybe
Mm,
just, a horrific situation that you didn't see coming, right? But relational trauma is a little bit more complicated because typically the people that we depend on for survival, that we are supposed to have a safe, loving, secure connection with, can also be the perpetrators. They can also be
mm,
doing the relational harm. And when we're young, we don't have that cognitive understanding. All we know is that this is my point person, this is my attachment, this is my safety. So I must figure out a way to maintain this safe connection with this person, and if that
mm.
means fawning or freezing or fleeing out of a situation, then I will do that. But it's not until much later when our brains are fully developed that we kind of go, hey, hold on a second. This isn't working any longer. Why isn't this working? And so, even just realizing that, yes, this was trauma, I think can be huge, pivotal for these clients.
That goes back to this idea of big T versus little t
Hmm.
trauma for me, because
Hmm.
everyone understands basically what big T trauma is, as you described already. It's a one-off significant
Yes.
event. Um, But little t trauma seems to be this, it's like the tide coming in. It's just this never ending series of episodes of personal invalidation.
Yes.
And people minimize it and they don't realize the impact of it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so to actually say this is trauma and you are a victim of trauma, first of all, it can be enlightening and very much validating, but it can also be a painful realization.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, just giving people the language, but also, again, the space to feel validated, to feel seen and heard. Because, in the States, we use the DSM for diagnoses, and complex PTSD is not recognized in the
no,
DSM, but it is
it's not.
recognized by the ICD. So we're moving in the right direction, right? But
Yeah.
we still have a
Well,
lot
I
of work
mean,
to do.
I think ICD-11, as you say, does recognize complex PTSD, but the definition of complex PTSD in ICD-11 is very, very specific and rigid and requires the full symptoms of PTSD
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
manifest, and then in addition has key features which include emotional dysregulation and poor interpersonal skills and a persistently negative self-view. So I still don't think it really encapsulates what I would see as the kind of that relational trauma that you've described, where people are just beaten down, worn down, burnt out, and fawning, freezing, that kind of issue. I mean, so yeah, ICD-11 is a little bit more advanced in the way to understanding how people behave and react to invalidating and negative experiences, but I don't think it's there yet. But the what I am frequently seeing in the way that I see people who freeze or fawn, as it were, is I like to understand it in terms of polyvagal theory, where you can either sit still and be at peace, or you can react with, fight or flight, or you can
Mhm.
freeze, where you sit still but you're in danger, but you're so overwhelmed that the only thing you can do is effectively physiologically and emotionally just play dead. I don't know if that resonates with you, those kind of
Sure.
three ways of dealing with the world.
Absolutely. And what I would add to that in my clients that at least that I see is there's a lot of hypervigilance. So there's a lot of guessing, there's a lot of storytelling internally, trying to predict the outcome and trying to get it just right. So if I
Yeah.
can just be vigilant enough, I can maybe um, escape this reaction of yours, or I can get myself to a safe place, right? And so
Mm,
it's really difficult for these clients to downshift with their
mm,
nervous system because they've just been up, for so long. So,
mm.
yeah.
So what message of hope would you give somebody listening to this discussion? What would you say?
Yeah. I think, it can feel a lot like doom and gloom when we talk about this, but the beauty of being able to name something is that once we name it, we kind of can't unknow it, right? And so pattern recognition, and we start learning how to exercise our voice. We start learning how to trust our gut instincts that we were maybe previously taught to ignore. We have neuroplasticity, right, in our brain. So our brain is constantly creating new neural pathways that can get strengthened by things like therapy and behavior modification and EMDR and all of the wonderful modalities that are out there in the mental health world to help us. And so what I like to tell clients that come in maybe with a disorganized attachment or, one of the other undesirable attachment styles is just because you have come from a place where you had a lot of rupture does not mean that you are doomed to have that attachment style for the rest of your life. You can
Mm.
grow into a secure, healthy adult attachment style. It's not easy, but if you can stay the course with someone that you feel safe with and that you can trust, we can learn to repattern.
We can learn to repattern. I think
Yeah.
that's a lovely point at which to end. But before we do end, I just want to clarify for the benefit of listeners and viewers, your podcast, how do we access your podcast?
Yeah, so you can find me at cindypayne.com. That's CINDYPAYNE. And all of my podcasts are uploaded there. You can find me at Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Reclaiming Me. And I put out episodes twice a week. So you can tune in. I do full length episodes on Mondays and then like a shorter reframe on Wednesdays.
Right.
So
Okay.
yeah.
And how do we access your expertise for one-on-one therapy then?
Sure. So if you are in the state of Texas or California, you can find me again at my website, and there will be an inquiry section, and I can connect with you there.
Okay. Cindy Payne, thank you so much for your expertise and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Fergal. I enjoyed it.
That's all for today, folks. I'm Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and this has been Cracking Addiction.